what's so great about your podcast and the book is that, of course, you've been through the trenches, you've gotten the no's, you've pushed through. And I'm so curious, you started doing these interviews in 2017, pre-pandemic. How has the word scale, or what it means to scale, changed post-pandemic? Has it changed at all?
Well, it certainly changes because it changes scale and entrepreneurship is all about what the competitive landscape looks like. It's competitive landscape in competitive companies and products. It's competitive landscape for hiring talent. It's competitive landscape in developing and deploying new products. And, part of, the work on Masters of Scale, the podcast, now the book, Blitzscaling, is all basically that you have to actually, the first to scale is the technology company that sets the rules, sets the platform. And so that dynamic, that driving competitive force is still there. Now, the way you do it is different because supply chains have changed, hiring has changed, the way that teams operate has changed. How all of this stuff happens in a more remote and some kind of hybrid environment is much more challenging. Now, the environment's still changing because, of course, maybe as we solve Delta, figure out kind of vaccination and testing, maybe actually, in fact, the hybrid gets much more back to work as well. So it's a constantly changing landscape.
Now, you interview everyone from Brian Chesky at Airbnb to some surprising guests like President Obama and Reid. The subtitle of the book is, in fact, Surprising Truths from the World's Most Successful Entrepreneurs. If you could pick one thing, and I know it's probably hard to do, which one of those truths surprised you most?
Well, I think the things that probably most surprised me is that the rules around entrepreneurship aren't just these kind of Silicon Valley lessons I've learned, but apply more broadly. It's talking to people who are mostly outside my network. So, Tyra Banks and how she made herself an enormously successful supermodel was approaching it like an entrepreneur. Franklin Leonard creating the Blacklist, Reid. All of these folks, actually, in fact, what you discover is these principles of entrepreneurship aren't just technology companies, aren't just kind of like the people who go, I'm going to go start a company, but how you're thinking about creating, something from nothing and then from something to, like huge scale.
Elon Musk has said entrepreneurship feels like swallowing glass and staring into the abyss of death. Do you think that anyone can be an entrepreneur, or does it take a special kind of person? Because it sounds terrifying.
Well, I think it's a good thing to think that it's terrifying. I use the jump off a cliff and assemble an airplane on the way down. It also is looking at the abyss below you, maybe a little bit less like swallowing glass. And it is very, very difficult. I do think that there's a combination of characteristics, a combination of risk tolerance, a combination of do you have the right safety net, which is one of the things that helps when you come from family with a little bit of money or other kinds of things. There's ways of doing that, a network that can support you, and that's part of some of where you have an easier time of it. But I do think that it can be learned. It's less taught, more learned. And so the experience doing it, joining companies, part of what we try to do in the podcast, in the courses app, in the book, is to say, here are the things that where you can be learning it, watching the journey, watching the experience, watching the lessons that these iconic folks who had to, in Elon's words, swallow glass, stare into the abyss, and yet still persevere.
Now, people get told no for all kinds of reasons. You speak to Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, Tristan Walker of Bevel, obviously dealing with problems that, many potentially white male investors didn't understand. There's also John Foley, the CEO of Peloton, who got told no. This surprised me a number of times. They thought he was too old, at 40 years old, to be an entrepreneur. How many world-changing companies do you think aren't being started, aren't being built right now because of a lack of access to opportunity, because of discrimination and bias? And how well is Silicon Valley doing to change that?
So the answer is a huge number, right? Easily 2x, 3x, 4x the number of companies if we just got the talent networks and the networks accessed right. And Silicon Valley, I think very thankfully, has in the last few years pretty committed to these efforts. I mean, at Greylock, we've been working with management leaders at Tomorrow and a bunch of different kind of venture firms, 645 Ventures, others, in order to have the broader pipeline for entrepreneurs, for investors, for companies getting financed. We do special office hours because network building, not surprisingly, from a co-founder of LinkedIn, is the way that you ultimately address this and just have the market do it because there's so much talent and so much capability there, and we're losing out on it. Now, the reason why it's not so simple to solve, and you know, like for example, Tristan is one of the people we had on Massive Scale. The reason why it's not so simple to solve is because we have this huge flood of a lot of noise where you're always looking for that signal, and so you have to make sure that the network gets built for, you know, the entrepreneurs of color, for women, for other sources in order to build this. But I think that we will see year by year progress because I think now people are putting it in their dashboards, they're putting it in a we must be doing this, and I think that then the engine will catch.
Meantime, some of the companies we're talking about here, Apple, Microsoft, these are companies worth more than $2 trillion. Google, Amazon, Facebook, almost there. Because of their scale, in part, they are facing regulatory scrutiny around the world. Is big in itself bad? Is scale, can scale potentially be one's downfall?
So I think it's a great question, and certainly they're getting pressure everywhere. Governments are uncomfortable because of, well, what's the throw weight, the profitability, the strength of these companies. On the other hand, part of when you get to how do we get the investment in the future we want? So for example, how do we get artificial intelligence created? Because artificial intelligence will be what creates robotics, which is what we'll have, if we have any hope, for example, in the US of a return to manufacturing, it's through artificial intelligence or robotics. That will come through investments that Microsoft, that, you know, Alphabet, that, you know, Amazon, that, you know, Facebook are all doing in order to make this happen. And so I don't think big is necessarily bad. Why? What's too big? The question is it helping the rest of society? And part of the reason I used manufacturing as an example is obviously we need a place where all of society is brought along on the new technological platforms for new jobs, for new kinds of opportunities for people, and that's something that we in the tech industry need to pay a lot of attention to, not just what do we do globally by creating great export products, which brings back a lot of interesting economics and capabilities back into the US, but also how do we help all these industries? Because all of these industries are in the process of technological revolution. Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes big isn't bad, but big by itself is not bad.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question, Reid, that you ask guests on your podcast, and I'm really curious for the answer here. What advice would you give to your high school self?
Well, fortunately, as you know, I actually wrote a book about this called The Startup of You, because I gave the commencement speech in my high school, and I was precisely scratching my head going, okay, what does a technology entrepreneur investor say to a bunch of high school students who are going to go out and be teachers and artists and creators and journalists and everything else? And it was be the entrepreneur of your own life. That the notion of a career ladder or career escalator, those are gone. It's now much more like a career jungle gym. And so you have to approach your life like an entrepreneur approaches their company. Now, as per your earlier question, that doesn't mean that everyone should go start a company, but the approach to a career is that. And for example, one kind of crisp thing to do is say, which smart risks can I take that give me an ability to kind of make interesting jumps in my career? And look for those risks. And what a smart risk is something that is not quite as risky as it looks and has a really good upside opportunity. And the reason other people aren't doing it is because it looks risky to them. And that kind of thing, thinking about that as career advice, would be something that you know, I learned the hard way and would have loved to apply earlier.